Welcome to the outskirts of Veracruz in New Spain in the year 1525, where a Spanish expedition of approximately 300 men, soldiers, enslaved indigenous laborers, and African slaves is preparing to march inland through the tropical jungle toward the Maya territories of the Yucatan Peninsula, following rumors of gold and cities waiting to be conquered, facing a journey through terrain that will test every man to his limits and that will kill many before they reach their destination. For the next few hours, we will explore how Spanish conquistadors actually crossed the jungles and mountains of the New World, examining the equipment they carried, the techniques they employed to navigate trackless wilderness, the indigenous knowledge they depended on for survival, and the brutal realities of expeditions that combined extraordinary ambition with inadequate preparation and devastating consequences for both the Spanish and the indigenous peoples they encountered. If you enjoy these detailed explorations of historical expeditions and the harsh realities behind legendary conquests, please like and subscribe to support our channel. Our story begins with a Spanish soldier named Diego Hernandez de Córdoba, a 30-year-old veteran of campaigns in Cuba and in the initial conquest of Mexico under Hernán Cortés. Diego is not wealthy. He is a common soldier, not a hidalgo or nobleman, but he has survived several years of campaigning in the New World and has developed the practical skills and hardened endurance required for survival in this environment. Diego stands in the expedition's assembly area, checking his equipment one final time before the departure scheduled for tomorrow morning. His equipment represents the standard kit of a Spanish soldier in the Americas, adapted somewhat from European warfare to the specific demands of the New World environment. His primary defensive equipment is a cotton armor called an escalpil, a thick quilted jacket made from multiple layers of cotton wadding, originating from indigenous Mesoamerican armor designs, but adopted by the Spanish because it provides reasonable protection from arrows and obsidian weapons, while being much lighter and more comfortable in tropical heat than European steel armor. The escalpil is approximately 1 inch thick, constructed from perhaps 20 layers of cotton batting, stitched between 2 layers of canvas. It covers Diego's torso and extends down to mid-thigh, with short sleeves covering the upper arms. This cotton armor represents a significant adaptation to New World conditions. The Spanish discovered early in their conquests that full steel plate armor, standard equipment for European cavalry, was impractical in the tropics. The metal conducted heat to dangerous levels under the tropical sun, and the armor provided minimal additional protection against indigenous weapons compared to its tremendous disadvantages. The cotton escalpil became standard equipment because it offered a better balance of protection, weight, and heat management. However, Diego does have some steel armor, a helmet called a morion, a distinctive peaked helmet providing protection for the head while allowing better vision than the fully enclosed helmets common in Europe. The helmet is heavy and uncomfortable in the heat, but head protection is essential against both weapons and the constant hazards of jungle travel. Falling branches, low-hanging obstacles, various injuries that could be catastrophic without protection. His offensive weapons include a sword, a single-edged cutting weapon called a falchion, approximately 30 inches in blade length, designed more for cutting than for thrusting, effective in the close-quarters combat that characterizes jungle fighting. The sword is steel, manufactured in Spain, one of the most valuable pieces of equipment Diego owns. He also carries a dagger as a backup weapon and utility tool. More importantly for jungle travel, Diego carries a machete, a heavy cutting tool with a blade approximately 18 inches long, designed for chopping through vegetation. The machete is not primarily a weapon but a survival tool, essential for clearing paths through dense undergrowth, for cutting materials for shelter construction, for countless other tasks that arise during jungle travel. His ranged weapon is a crossbow, a mechanical bow that shoots short, heavy bolts with considerable force and accuracy. The crossbow is more reliable in tropical humidity than firearms, which suffer from moisture affecting gunpowder, and from the difficulty of keeping matchlocks or wheel locks functioning in wet conditions. Diego's crossbow is made from wood and steel, with a steel bow providing substantial draw weight and good range. He carries approximately 30 bolts in a quiver, each bolt tipped with a steel point, capable of penetrating indigenous armor and shields. The choice between crossbows and firearms is a constant debate among conquistadors. Firearms, arquebuses, have superior range and psychological impact. Their noise and smoke terrifying to indigenous peoples unfamiliar with gunpowder weapons. But firearms are temperamental in tropical conditions, slow to reload, and dependent on maintaining dry gunpowder, a constant challenge in humid jungles. Crossbows are more reliable, faster to reload, and require no gunpowder, but they lack the range and shock value of firearms. Diego's other equipment includes a leather pack containing his personal possessions and supplies, a change of clothing, a wool blanket for sleeping, a small quantity of hardtack biscuit, and salted meat, provisions for perhaps 3 days, after which the expedition will depend on foraging and what food they can obtain from indigenous peoples. A water skin holding approximately 2 quarts, and various small items. Sewing kit for repairing clothes and equipment, tinder and flint for fire starting, a whetstone for sharpening blades, a small pot for cooking. He also carries rope, approximately 30 feet of hemp rope, useful for countless purposes from setting up shelters to crossing rivers to securing loads. The expedition as a whole carries hundreds of feet of rope, but each soldier maintains his own personal supply for immediate needs. The total weight of Diego's equipment is perhaps 40 pounds, the escalpel weighing about 10 pounds, the helmet 5 pounds, weapons and tools another 15 pounds, pack and provisions 10 pounds. This is a substantial load, but far lighter than the 60 or 70 pounds a fully armored European soldier might carry, reflecting the adaptations necessary for jungle warfare. As Diego completes his equipment check, he joins other soldiers gathering for a briefing from the expedition's commander, Captain Rodrigo de Bastidas, a minor nobleman who has obtained royal authorization and funding for this expedition. Bastidas addresses the assembled force, outlining the route and objectives. We march west and south, following the coastal plain until we reach the mountains, then crossing through the passes to reach the Maya territories beyond, Bastidas explains, gesturing to a crude map drawn on parchment, one of perhaps 3 or 4 maps the expedition possesses, all based on reports from previous explorers and from indigenous informants, all of questionable accuracy. The journey will be difficult. We will face jungle, mountains, rivers, hostile natives, but the rewards will be worth the hardship. The Maya possess gold, cities, rich lands for settlement. Those who survive this expedition and who serve faithfully will receive land grants, shares of plunder, positions in the new territories we conquer. This promise of wealth and advancement motivates the soldiers despite the known dangers. Most are from poor backgrounds in Spain, with limited prospects in Europe. The Americas offer opportunities, however dangerous, for advancement that would be impossible at home. The chance to obtain land, wealth, and status is worth risking death, disease, and suffering. Bastidas continues with practical instructions. We will march in organized companies, maintaining discipline and formation, even in difficult terrain. Scouts will range ahead to identify paths and to warn of hostile forces. Indigenous porters will carry the heavy equipment and provisions, weapons, ammunition, tools, food supplies. Each soldier is responsible for his personal equipment and for maintaining his ability to fight. The mention of indigenous porters is significant. The expedition includes approximately 200 indigenous and African enslaved people who will carry the bulk of the expedition's supplies and equipment. These porters are essential. The Spanish soldiers could not possibly carry all the food, ammunition, tools, and other materials required for an extended expedition. The porters are treated as expendable labor, driven harshly, often dying from exhaustion, disease, or abuse during the march. Also, accompanying the expedition are several indigenous guides, members of groups allied with or subjugated by the Spanish, who possess knowledge of the terrain, of routes through the jungle, of water sources and food resources. These guides are crucial to the expedition's success, though the Spanish often fail to fully appreciate or acknowledge their importance. One such guide is a Nahua man named Cuauhtémoc, not the famous Aztec emperor of the same name, but a common person named after him, approximately 25 years old, originally from a village near Veracruz, who has worked with the Spanish for several years, and who speaks some Spanish, in addition to his native Nahuatl. Cuauhtémoc knows the coastal jungles well, and has traveled some distance inland on previous occasions. His knowledge of paths, of water sources, of dangerous areas, of how to identify edible plants and safe camps will prove far more valuable than Bastidas' crude maps. But Cuauhtémoc's position is precarious. He is not trusted by the Spanish, to see all indigenous people as potential enemies, or at best, as necessary but unreliable tools. He is resented by many of the indigenous porters, who see him as a collaborator with the oppressors. He serves the Spanish partly from necessity. His village has been subjugated, and he has little choice, and partly from pragmatic calculation, but cooperation offers better survival prospects than resistance. As the final preparations continue through the evening, Diego reflects on what lies ahead. He has heard stories from veterans of other jungle expeditions, tales of men dying from disease, from snakebite, from hostile natives, from simple exhaustion in the oppressive heat and humidity. He has heard about rivers too deep to ford, about mountains too steep to climb, about impenetrable jungle where men hacked paths for hours to advance a few hundred yards. But he has also heard tales of gold and treasure, of rich cities waiting to be plundered, of land grants and positions of authority for successful conquistadors. These promises, however uncertain, outweigh the known dangers for men like Diego, who have few other paths to advancement. As night falls and the camp settles into final preparations, the expedition's chaplain, a Franciscan friar named Bartolome, conducts a mass, blessing the expedition and the men, praying for their success and safe return. The religious ceremony serves multiple purposes, providing spiritual comfort to the soldiers, reinforcing the expedition's claimed justification as a mission to spread Christianity, creating a sense of divine favor and purpose. After the Mass, Diego finds his sleeping spot among the other common soldiers, wrapping himself in his blanket, trying to rest before tomorrow's departure. Around him, 300 men and the enslaved porters prepare similarly. Some sleeping, others making final equipment adjustments, others talking quietly about what awaits them in the jungle. Tomorrow, the march begins. The expedition will leave the relative safety and familiarity of the coastal settlement and enter the trackless jungle, beginning a journey that will test every man's endurance, that will demonstrate both the remarkable determination of the conquistadors and the devastating inadequacy of their preparation, that will reveal the crucial role of indigenous knowledge and labor in making Spanish conquest possible, and that will inflict suffering on both the Spanish soldiers and on the indigenous peoples whose lands and lives will be devastated by the expedition's passage. The expedition departs Veracruz at dawn, forming into a column perhaps a quarter-mile long. Soldiers, porters, pack animals, the few horses the expedition has brought, all moving in loose formation along a rough trail that leads west from the settlement into the coastal plain. For the first day, travel is relatively easy. The trail is well established, used by indigenous peoples and by Spanish expeditions for the past few years. The terrain is open woodland and grassland, hot but not oppressive, with clear paths and no need to cut through dense vegetation. But by the second day, the trail deteriorates. The expedition is now beyond the range of regular Spanish travel, moving into areas where only indigenous paths exist, and even these are often overgrown and difficult to follow. The terrain becomes more densely vegetated, the canopy closing overhead, the humidity increasing as they enter true tropical jungle. Let us follow Diego Hernandez through this transition, observing the techniques and challenges of jungle travel as the expedition encounters conditions that will characterize most of their journey. The morning of the third day begins with the discovery that the trail they were following has disappeared entirely, either overgrown beyond recognition or simply ending, having been an animal track rather than a human path. The expedition scouts report back that forward progress will require cutting a path through dense undergrowth. Captain Bastidas orders a halt while he consults with the guides and with his officers about how to proceed. Cuauhtemoc, the Nahua guide, examines the terrain ahead, noting the density of vegetation, the slope of the ground, the presence of a small stream, perhaps 200 yards to the north. "We should follow the stream," Cuauhtemoc suggests in his limited Spanish. "The ground near water is often clearer, easier to travel, and following water, we cannot become lost. Streams flow downhill, leading eventually to larger rivers, to valleys where travel is easier." This advice reflects indigenous knowledge of jungle navigation, using watercourses as natural paths, understanding that rivers create corridors through otherwise impenetrable vegetation, recognizing that following water provides both a navigation reference and access to a critical resource. But Bastidas is skeptical of indigenous advice, preferring to follow his maps and his own judgment. We need to maintain our westward course, not wander following streams that might lead us away from our objective. This tension between Spanish assumptions and indigenous knowledge is a constant feature of conquistador expeditions. The Spanish believe themselves superior in all ways, including navigation and strategy, but in reality, they often lack the local knowledge essential for survival. When they ignore it, they often suffer. In this case, Bastidas reluctantly agrees to move toward the stream, recognizing that the current terrain is impassable without enormous effort to cut through. The expedition changes direction, moving north through slightly less dense vegetation, and after an hour reaches the stream Cuauhtémoc identified. The stream is perhaps 10 feet wide and a foot deep, flowing over a rocky bed, the water clear and cool. The banks are less densely vegetated than the surrounding jungle, providing a natural corridor for travel. The expedition begins following the stream westward, the direction they want to go, making considerably better progress than they would have cutting through the dense jungle. But even following the stream, progress is slow and difficult. The expedition is traveling at perhaps 1 mile per hour, sometimes less when terrain is particularly difficult. The soldiers are already exhausted from the heat and humidity. It is mid-morning, the temperature perhaps 90 degrees Fahrenheit, the humidity near 100%, conditions that make physical exertion extremely taxing. Diego is drenched in sweat, his cotton armor soaked through, his skin chafing where the wet fabric rubs. The helmet on his head feels like it weighs 50 pounds instead of 5, and he removes it despite regulations, unable to bear the additional heated traps. Around him, other soldiers are similarly suffering, faces red, breathing labored, some men already showing signs of heat exhaustion. The indigenous porters, while also suffering from the heat and from the heavy loads they carry, seem to handle the conditions better than the Spanish. They are acclimated to tropical heat, they wear lighter clothing more appropriate for the environment, and they have knowledge of how to pace themselves and how to manage heat stress. Around midday, Bastidas orders a halt for rest and the afternoon meal. The soldiers collapse in whatever shade they can find, grateful for the respite. Food is distributed: hardtack biscuit, salted meat, water from the stream. The meal is meager and unappetizing, but it provides necessary calories and hydration. Diego eats mechanically, too exhausted to have much appetite despite the day's exertion. He drinks heavily from his water skin, refilling it multiple times from the stream. The water is questionable. It could contain parasites or disease, but the alternative is dehydration, which will kill far more quickly than any waterborne illness. As the men rest, the reality of jungle travel becomes increasingly clear. This is not the dramatic adventure of legend, but a grinding ordeal of heat, exhaustion, and slow progress through hostile terrain. The jungle itself is the primary enemy, not indigenous warriors or wild animals, but simply the vegetation, the heat, the humidity, the endless discomfort and difficulty. Insects are a constant torment. Mosquitoes swarm in clouds, biting any exposed skin, their numbers overwhelming. The Spanish have no effective protection. They can cover exposed skin with clothing, but this increases heat stress. They can use smoke from fires to drive insects away temporarily, but they cannot maintain fires while traveling. They simply must endure the constant biting and the maddening irritation. Other insects are more dangerous. Diego notices several men scratching at angry red welts, likely bites from fire ants or other venomous insects. One soldier has a swollen hand from a wasp sting, the hand red and painful, likely to remain swollen for days. Another man reports a tick buried in his scalp, which must be carefully removed to prevent infection. The vegetation itself presents hazards. Many plants have thorns or spines that catch on clothing and scratch skin. Some plants cause skin irritation on contact. Diego brushes against a plant that within minutes causes his arm to itch intensely, the skin developing a red rash. The guide Cuauhtémoc identifies it as a toxic plant and suggests washing the affected area immediately with water and rubbing with certain leaves that reduce the reaction. After approximately 2 hours of rest, Bastidas orders the expedition to resume the march. The soldiers rise reluctantly, shoulders their equipment, and fall back into formation, continuing westward, following the stream. The afternoon is worse than the morning. The heat peaks, the humidity becomes even more oppressive, and the cumulative exhaustion from days of hard travel begins to tell. Men stumble, fall behind, require assistance from their companions. Several porters collapse from the combined effects of heat, exhaustion, and the brutal loads they carry, and are whipped or beaten by Spanish overseers to force them back to their feet. This casual brutality toward the indigenous laborers is shocking by modern standards, but is entirely normal for the conquistadors, who view the enslaved people as property rather than as human beings deserving of consideration, extracting maximum labor with minimal concern for their welfare, accepting that some will die, and calculating that it is more economical to work them to death and replace them than to treat them humanely. By late afternoon, after approximately 8 hours of travel, the expedition has covered perhaps 6 miles, a pace that would be considered extremely slow under normal conditions, but that represents reasonable progress given the terrain and conditions. Conquistadors orders camp to be established in a relatively open area near the stream, where there is space for the men to sleep and where water is readily available. The establishment of camp is organized chaos. The porters are directed to clear ground, to cut poles for shelters, to gather firewood, to prepare food. The soldiers erect simple shelters, canvas or cloth stretched over wooden frames, providing minimal protection from rain and insects, but at least offering some shelter. The horses and pack animals are tethered and fed from the diminishing supply of fodder carried for them. Diego helps construct a shelter for himself and several other soldiers, cutting poles using his machete, stretching canvas over the framework, securing it with rope. The work is tiring after the day's march, but the shelter is necessary. The jungle weather can change rapidly, and being caught without shelter in a tropical downpour is miserable and potentially dangerous. As evening falls and fires are lit for cooking and warmth, the character of the jungle changes. The daytime heat gives way to humid warmth, still uncomfortable, but less oppressive. The insect species change. Mosquitoes remain numerous, but other night-active insects emerge, filling the jungle with sound, an almost deafening chorus of clicks, buzzes, and chirps. The darkness under the jungle canopy is profound, much darker than in open country, where moonlight and starlight provide some illumination. The fires create pools of light, but beyond their reach, the jungle is an impenetrable black wall, filled with sounds of unknown creatures and unknown dangers. Diego eats the evening meal, more hardtack and salted meat, supplemented with some cassava root obtained from an indigenous village they passed yesterday, cooked into a starchy porridge. The food is filling but monotonous, lacking the variety and flavor of the diet he knew in Spain or even in Veracruz. After eating, Diego checks his equipment, making repairs where needed. His sword requires sharpening. The day's travel through vegetation has dulled the blade. His boots are showing wear, the leather cracked and stressed from constant moisture. His cotton armor is still damp from sweat and will likely remain damp indefinitely in this humidity. As full darkness falls and most of the camp settles into exhausted sleep, Diego takes his turn on watch, a rotation of guards maintained every night to protect against surprise attack by hostile natives or animals. He stands near the camp perimeter, crossbow loaded, peering into the darkness, seeing nothing but hearing the endless sounds of the jungle night. This watch duty is tense and uncomfortable. Every sound could be an approaching enemy. Every movement in the darkness could be a threat. Diego's imagination conjures dangers from the unknown jungle. Jaguars, snakes, hostile warriors, supernatural entities that the indigenous people describe in stories the Spanish only half understand. But the night passes without incident, and when Diego is relieved by the next watch, he returns to the shelter and collapses into sleep, knowing that tomorrow will bring another day of exhausting travel, another 10 or 12 miles of slow progress through the jungle, another test of endurance and will that will continue for weeks until the expedition reaches its objective or until it fails and must turn back. This is the reality of conquistador jungle travel. Not heroic adventure, but grinding hardship, slow progress through hostile terrain, dependence on indigenous knowledge and labor, constant suffering from heat, insects, disease, and exhaustion, all endured in pursuit of wealth and conquest that may or may not materialize, driven by ambition and desperation in equal measure. After 10 days of difficult travel through increasingly rugged terrain, the expedition reaches a major obstacle, a large river, perhaps 100 yards wide, flowing swiftly with muddy brown water, clearly too deep to ford on foot, and with current too strong for safe swimming even for strong swimmers. This river crossing represents a significant engineering challenge that will test the expedition's problem-solving capabilities, and that will demonstrate both Spanish technical knowledge and the crucial importance of indigenous expertise. Let us follow the expedition's response to this obstacle, observing the techniques and tools employed to cross rivers in the absence of bridges or boats. Captain Bastidas stands on the riverbank, assessing the situation. The current is swift. Objects thrown into the water are quickly swept downstream. The water is opaque, making it impossible to judge depth accurately, but it is clearly deep, several feet at minimum, possibly much deeper in the center channel. There is no obvious ford, no shallower crossing point visible along the river's length. "We need to cross," Bastidas states to his officers and to the guides. "What options do we have?" One Spanish sergeant suggests building rafts, cutting logs, lashing them together with rope, floating the men and equipment across. This is a standard European solution to river crossing problems, drawing on timber construction techniques familiar to Spanish soldiers from military engineering training. But Cuauhtémoc, the Nahua guide, offers a different approach. The local people use vine bridges, he explains. Strong vines that grow in the trees. We can weave them into ropes, stretch them across the river between trees, create a bridge for people to cross. Also, we can make canoes, hollow log boats, if we have time to cut and shape the logs. This indigenous knowledge offers potentially superior solutions to the European raft concept. Vine bridges can span gaps that rafts cannot safely cross, and they can be built with materials readily available in the jungle. Canoes, while time-consuming to construct, are superior to rafts for navigating swift currents. Bastidas, reluctantly accepting the value of indigenous expertise in this situation, orders that multiple approaches be attempted simultaneously. Some men will work on constructing rafts, others will explore the vine bridge option, and a team will begin creating canoes. Whichever method proves most effective will be used for the main crossing. Let us follow Diego and a group of soldiers assigned to the raft building team, observing the techniques and challenges of this work. The raft construction begins with selecting and cutting suitable logs. The logs must be reasonably straight, approximately the same diameter, and made from wood that floats well. Some tropical hardwoods are too dense and will sink rather than float. Diego and the others use axes to fell trees, selecting species that Cuauhtémoc and the other indigenous porters identify as appropriate. Each log must be trimmed of branches and cut to appropriate length, approximately 10 feet long, creating manageable pieces that can be assembled into raft sections. The work is exhausting in the tropical heat, swinging axes repeatedly to cut through substantial tree trunks, then trimming and shaping the logs for use. Once a sufficient number of logs are prepared, perhaps 20 logs for a raft that will be approximately 10 feet by 10 feet, the assembly process begins. The logs are laid parallel to each other on the ground, and cross pieces are lashed across them using rope, creating a framework that holds the logs together. The lashing is critical. The ropes must be tight enough to prevent the logs from shifting during use, but not so tight that they constrict the log's natural buoyancy. Diego learns the appropriate knots and lashing techniques through trial and error, guided by the expedition's few men who have previous raft building experience. After approximately 6 hours of hard work, the first raft is complete and ready for testing. A team of men drags it to the water's edge and pushes it into the river. Initially, it seems to work. The raft floats, the logs providing adequate buoyancy. But when several men climb aboard to test its carrying capacity, problems become apparent. The raft sits very low in the water, barely afloat under the weight of 4 men and their equipment. The current immediately begins pushing it downstream, and the men struggle to control its direction using poles and paddles improvised from boards. After drifting perhaps 50 yards downstream, the men abandon the attempt, swimming back to shore and allowing the raft to drift away. The rafts are too heavy and too difficult to control. The sergeant in charge of the raft team reports to Bastidas. "We could probably get men across eventually, but we'd lose equipment and possibly men to the current. It's not a good solution." Meanwhile, the canoe-building team has made progress. Working under the direction of indigenous porters who have experience with this work, they have selected a suitable tree, a large straight tree with wood that is relatively soft and easy to work, and have felled it and begun the process of hollowing it out to create a dugout canoe. The technique involves burning and scraping, building small controlled fires on the log's upper surface to char the wood, then scraping out the charred material with stone or metal tools, repeating the process to gradually create a hollow interior. This is time-consuming work. Creating a usable canoe takes several days, but the result is a vessel far superior to rafts for navigating swift water. The Vine Bridge team has also had success. Cuauhtemoc leads this effort, demonstrating techniques that his people have used for generations. Strong vines are harvested from the jungle, thick, woody vines that grow in the canopy, capable of supporting considerable weight. These vines are woven together into ropes approximately 2 inches in diameter, creating cables with impressive strength. 2 of the strongest swimmers among the indigenous porters, men accustomed to these tasks, swim across the river carrying light ropes, which are then used to pull the heavier vine cables across. The cables are secured to large trees on both banks, creating fixed anchor points. Additional vines are woven to create a walking surface, and the result is a suspended bridge, precarious and swaying but functional for crossing the river. Diego is among the first Spanish soldiers to cross using the vine bridge. He approaches nervously. The bridge looks frighteningly insubstantial, swaying in the breeze, hanging perhaps 15 feet above the swift water. But the indigenous porters cross confidently, demonstrating that it can support human weight. Diego steps onto the bridge, gripping the vine handrails, taking small, careful steps. The bridge sways and bounces with his movement, creating a nauseating sense of instability. Below, the brown river rushes past, swift and dangerous. Diego focuses on the far bank, trying not to look down, moving slowly but steadily. A gust of wind sets the bridge swinging more dramatically, and Diego freezes, gripping the handrails desperately, certain he is about to fall. But the bridge holds, and after the swaying subsides, he continues forward, finally reaching the far bank with profound relief. Other soldiers follow, most crossing successfully, though several refuse, paralyzed by fear of the swaying bridge. For these men, an alternative is provided. They are ferried across in the dugout canoes, which by now are completed and functional. The canoes prove to be the most effective solution for transporting equipment and for moving men who cannot or will not use the vine bridge. Each canoe can carry several men plus equipment, and while the strong current requires skillful paddling to prevent being swept downstream, the indigenous canoeists manage the crossings competently. Over the course of 2 days, the entire expedition crosses the river using the combination of vine bridge and canoes. Some equipment is lost, including one of the precious horses that panics during a canoe crossing and drowns, but the majority of the expedition makes it across intact. This river crossing demonstrates several important realities of conquistador jungle expeditions. First, European military engineering techniques, while useful, are often inferior to indigenous methods for dealing with jungle and tropical environments. The Spanish raft approach was less effective than the indigenous canoe and vine bridge solutions. Second, the expeditions are absolutely dependent on indigenous knowledge and labor. Without the guides who knew how to identify appropriate vines and how to construct vine bridges, without the porters who had canoe-building skills, the Spanish would have been unable to cross the river or would have suffered much greater losses attempting to do so. Third, such obstacles consume enormous amounts of time. 2 full days lost to this single crossing, time that depletes food supplies, extends the expedition's duration, and increases the cumulative stress and exhaustion on all participants. As the expedition regroups on the far side of the river and prepares to continue westward, the soldiers are exhausted and demoralized by the delay and difficulty. The river crossing has driven home the reality that the jungle is not a passive background to their expedition, but an active opponent that must be overcome through constant effort, innovation, and resilience. Diego looks back at the river they've crossed and at the vine bridge that still spans it, a testament to indigenous engineering skill. He feels a grudging respect for the indigenous people who built it, though this respect is mixed with the contempt and superiority that characterize Spanish attitudes toward the peoples they are conquering. Ahead lies more jungle, more rivers, more mountains, more obstacles between the expedition and its objective. The journey is far from over, and every man knows that more hardships and more challenges await in the days and weeks to come. By the 3rd week of the expedition, the toll of jungle travel has become severe. Disease and injuries are decimating both the Spanish soldiers and the indigenous porters, creating a crisis that threatens the expedition's ability to continue. Let us examine the medical challenges of jungle expeditions through the experiences of several individuals suffering from the various ailments that afflict conquistador expeditions in the tropics. Diego Hernandez himself has developed dysentery, a condition characterized by severe diarrhea, abdominal cramping, and sometimes bloody stools. He has been suffering for 3 days, gradually weakening as the illness prevents proper digestion and causes severe dehydration. This morning he can barely stand, his legs weak, his head spinning with dehydration and malnutrition. Dysentery is one of the most common killers on jungle expeditions. The disease spreads through contaminated water and food, thrives in the poor sanitation conditions that characterize expedition camps, and can be fatal if severe and untreated. Diego likely contracted it from drinking river water or from contaminated food, and now he joins approximately 15 other men currently suffering from similar symptoms. The expedition's medical treatment options are extremely limited. The expedition has one surgeon, a barber surgeon named Alonso, who has some medical training, but who operates with the primitive medical knowledge of the early 16th century. His treatments for dysentery consist primarily of purging, giving patients drugs to induce vomiting and diarrhea, ironically making the condition worse, bloodletting, removing blood in the mistaken belief that this will restore bodily humus to balance, and providing some herbal remedies of questionable effectiveness. Alonso examines Diego, noting his weakness, his fever, his dehydration. "You need rest and liquids," he advises, offering the most sensible medical guidance he possesses. "Drink water frequently, even if you feel nauseated. Eat what you can. I'll prepare a remedy of cinnamon and honey that may help." The cinnamon and honey remedy has some actual benefit. Honey has mild antibacterial properties and provides easily digestible calories, while cinnamon has some anti-inflammatory effects. But the treatment is far from adequate for severe dysentery, and Diego's condition will depend primarily on his own constitution and immune system rather than on any medical intervention. While Diego suffers from dysentery, other men face different medical crises. A soldier named Pedro has developed a severe tropical fever, likely malaria, though the expedition members don't understand disease transmission and attribute the fever to bad air or imbalances in bodily humours. Pedro burns with fever, experiences severe chills alternating with intense sweating, suffers from hallucinations and delirium. Without quinine or other effective antimalarial drugs, which won't be discovered for centuries, his treatment consists of bloodletting and prayer, neither of which will significantly affect the disease's course. Malaria is endemic in the tropical lowlands of the Americas, and it is devastating to Europeans who lack any previous exposure or immunity. The disease will kill many conquistadors and will incapacitate many more, creating a constant drain on the expedition's fighting strength. Another soldier, Juan, has developed a severe infection in his leg from a cut sustained several days ago while cutting through thick vegetation. The wound became contaminated with soil or plant material, and despite attempts at cleaning, infection has developed. The leg is swollen, hot to the touch, with red streaks extending from the wound, signs of spreading infection that in modern medicine would be treated with antibiotics, but that in 1525 has no effective treatment. Alonso examines Juan's leg and makes the grim assessment that amputation may be necessary to save the man's life. Without antibiotics, severe infections often require amputation to prevent them from spreading to the rest of the body and causing death from sepsis. But amputation in jungle conditions, without anesthesia, with primitive surgical tools, with minimal ability to control bleeding or prevent infection of the surgical site, is itself highly likely to be fatal. Juan begs to avoid amputation, hoping that the infection will resolve on its own, or that less drastic treatment will prove effective. Alonso agrees to wait another day or two, applying poultices and draining pus from the wound, but warns that if the infection continues to spread, amputation will be the only option. Beyond the Spanish soldiers, the indigenous porters are suffering even more severely. They have less access to food. The Spanish take priority for the limited provisions, and they are worked harder, carrying heavier loads for longer hours. Their death rate is much higher than the Spanish death rate, but their deaths are barely noted in the expedition's records, viewed as acceptable losses of expendable labor rather than as human tragedies. One porter, a young man named Tlaloc, has developed severe foot infections from walking barefoot through the jungle. His feet are masses of cuts, punctures, and infected wounds, making every step agony. He can barely walk, but he is driven forward by threats and beatings from the Spanish overseers, forced to continue despite his injuries. Another porter has developed what appears to be a severe skin infection or tropical ulcer, a large festering wound on his arm that is slowly expanding, destroying tissue, creating a horrible appearance and smell. This condition, left untreated, will likely prove fatal, but no treatment is offered. The Spanish view the porter as too debilitated to be worth the effort of medical care, a cold calculation that the man will likely die anyway, and that resources are better spent on those with better survival prospects. The expedition has also suffered several deaths from snakebite. The jungles of the Americas contain numerous venomous snakes, and several men have been bitten while walking through vegetation or while sleeping on the ground. The treatment for snakebite is primitive, cutting open the wound and attempting to suck out venom, applying poultices, hoping that the venom dose was small enough that the victim's body can survive it. One soldier died within hours of being bitten, the venom apparently affecting his nervous system, causing paralysis and respiratory failure. Another survived the initial bite, but developed severe necrosis at the wound site, the flesh dying and sloughing away, creating a ghastly wound that will require amputation if he survives long enough for such treatment. Beyond acute injuries and diseases, the expedition members suffer from chronic conditions exacerbated by the harsh environment. Malnutrition is becoming severe. The expedition's food supplies are running low, and foraging has provided only limited supplementation. Men are losing weight, developing vitamin deficiency diseases, like scurvy, from lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, suffering from weakness and fatigue that make the daily travel increasingly difficult. Skin conditions are universal: rashes from plant contact, fungal infections from constant moisture, ulcers from insect bites that have become infected. Almost every man has multiple skin lesions at various stages of healing and infection, creating constant discomfort and adding to the misery of jungle travel. The psychological toll is also severe. The constant suffering, the deaths of companions, the apparently endless jungle stretching ahead, the dwindling food supplies, all of these create despair and demoralization. Some men talk openly about desertion, about turning back, about abandoning the expedition. Only the threats of punishment and the practical reality that deserters would likely die alone in the jungle prevent more men from attempting to leave. Captain Bastidas faces a crisis. The expedition has suffered approximately 30 deaths among the Spanish soldiers, 10% of his original force, and perhaps twice that many among the indigenous porters. Many more are sick or injured, unable to fight effectively if they encounter hostile forces. The daily rate of progress has slowed as more men struggle with illness and exhaustion. Bastidas calls a council with his officers to assess whether the expedition should continue or turn back. The discussion is heated. Some officers argue that they are too depleted to continue, that they should return to Veracruz before more men die. Others argue that turning back now would waste all the suffering already endured, that they must push forward to the objective and hope to find wealth that will justify the losses. Bastidas ultimately decides to continue, motivated partly by stubbornness, partly by the calculation that returning empty-handed would damage his reputation and would make it difficult to secure funding for future expeditions, partly by the hope that the worst is over and that conditions will improve as they reach the mountains and exit the lowland jungle. "We continue," he announces. "We have come too far to turn back. We will reach the Maya territories. We will find the riches we seek, and those who survive will be rewarded for their suffering." This decision commits the expedition to continuing despite the heavy casualties and the questionable prospects of success. It is a decision characteristic of conquistador expeditions, driven by ambition, by pride, by the refusal to accept failure, even when pragmatic assessment would suggest retreat. As the expedition prepares to resume the march the next morning, Diego drags himself to his feet, despite his weakness from dysentery. He can barely carry his equipment, but he forces himself forward, driven by a combination of duty, fear of punishment for falling behind, and the stubborn determination that has brought him through previous hardships. Around him, other sick and injured men similarly force themselves to continue, creating a tragic spectacle of exhausted sick men pushing themselves beyond reasonable limits in pursuit of wealth and conquest that may never materialize. This is the reality of conquistador expeditions that the legends and adventure stories often omit. The disease, the suffering, the high death rates, the medical helplessness in the face of tropical diseases and injuries, the brutal treatment of indigenous people, the questionable judgment that drives expeditions to continue, even when turning back would be more rational. The conquest of the Americas was built on such suffering, on the backs of men who endured tremendous hardship, on the exploitation of indigenous peoples, on a combination of determination, cruelty, and reckless ambition that achieved Spanish objectives at terrible human cost. As the expedition continues through its fourth week, having crossed the coastal jungle and begun ascending into the foothills of the mountains that separate the coastal plain from the interior highlands, the challenges of navigation without roads or accurate maps become increasingly critical. Let us examine how conquistador expeditions actually navigated through unknown territory, observing the combination of Spanish tools, indigenous knowledge, and often sheer guesswork that characterized route finding in the New World. Captain Bastidas possesses several navigation tools and information sources. He has a crude map, a parchment document showing the general outline of the coast and indicating approximately where the Maya territories lie relative to Veracruz. The map was drawn based on previous Spanish expeditions and on information from indigenous informants, but its accuracy is questionable at best. Distances are approximate, terrain features are schematic, and many areas are simply blank spaces marked unknown. He also has a compass, a magnetic compass in a brass case, one of the most valuable pieces of equipment the expedition possesses. The compass reliably indicates magnetic north, providing a reference direction even when the sun is obscured by clouds or jungle canopy. This allows Bastidas to maintain a generally westward course, despite the twisting paths required to navigate around obstacles. For determining latitude, the expedition's position north-south, Bastidas has an astrolabe, an astronomical instrument that can measure the angle of celestial objects above the horizon. By measuring the altitude of the North Star at night or the sun at noon, Bastidas can calculate the approximate latitude, allowing him to know whether the expedition is north or south of their intended position. However, Bastidas lacks any means of determining longitude, east-west position, with accuracy. Longitude determination requires accurate timekeeping, which won't be possible until the invention of the marine chronometer in the 18th century. Without knowing longitude, Bastidas can only estimate how far west they have traveled based on dead reckoning, tracking their daily progress, accounting for detours and obstacles, maintaining a running estimate of distance traveled. This morning, Bastidas takes a sun sight using his astrolabe, measuring the sun's altitude at what he estimates to be noon. The measurement is difficult. The astrolabe must be held level while sighting through its alidade, sighting vane, at the sun, a challenging task while standing on uneven ground. The measurement also requires knowing the exact time of local noon, which Bastidas estimates by observing when the sun reaches its highest point in the sky. After taking the sight and consulting his astronomical tables, printed tables showing the sun's position at various latitudes on various dates, Bastidas calculates that the expedition is at approximately 19 degrees north latitude. This matches reasonably well with his expectations based on their starting point and their travel direction, confirming that they have maintained their intended latitude reasonably well. But latitude alone is insufficient for navigation. Bastidas needs to know how far west they have traveled, and for this he must rely on his dead reckoning estimates. He consults his journal, reviewing the daily distance estimates he has recorded. The estimates are necessarily approximate. Judging distance traveled through jungle is difficult. On some days, the expedition has covered 8 or 10 miles. On other days, when terrain was particularly difficult, or when river crossings or other obstacles consumes time, they have covered only 2 or 3 miles. Bastidas estimates they have traveled approximately 200 miles west from Veracruz, but this figure could easily be wrong by 20 or 30%. Moreover, the route has not been straight westward, but has involved numerous detours to avoid impassable terrain, to follow river valleys, to bypass hostile indigenous settlements. The actual straight-line distance westward is probably less than the total distance traveled, but by how much, Bastidas cannot know precisely. Given these uncertainties, Bastidas consults with the indigenous guides, particularly Cuauhtémoc, whose knowledge of the terrain and of indigenous geographic knowledge provides essential context that the Spanish tools and maps cannot. How far to the Maya territories? Bastidas asks, through the expedition's translator. Cuauhtémoc considers the question, looking at the surrounding terrain, noting the elevation and the vegetation types, drawing on his own knowledge of the region's geography, and on information he has obtained from indigenous people they have encountered. Perhaps 10 days' travel, he estimates, if we continue west through the mountains. But the mountain paths are difficult, steep slopes, narrow trails, places where the expedition cannot pass. It might be faster to turn southwest, descend into the valley, travel along the lowlands. This suggestion reflects indigenous understanding of efficient travel routes, knowing where practical paths exist, where terrain becomes impassable for large groups, where to trade distance for easier travel. But it also reflects the reality that indigenous geographic knowledge is organized differently than European map-based navigation. Indigenous peoples of the Americas often navigate by following known routes between key locations, memorizing the sequence of landmarks and the characteristics of the path, rather than by understanding abstract geometric relationships on maps. Their knowledge is often more accurate for practical navigation than European maps, but it is also more difficult for the Spanish to access and interpret. Bastidas faces a decision whether to continue his planned westward route through the mountains or to alter course following Cuauhtémoc's suggestion. The decision is complicated by his distrust of indigenous advice, by his desire to demonstrate Spanish superiority by following his own plans, and by practical concerns about food supplies and the expedition's deteriorating condition. Bastidas decides on a compromise. They will continue west for 2 more days, then reassess based on the terrain they encounter. This allows him to maintain his original plan while leaving open the option to adjust based on circumstances. As the expedition continues into the mountains, the navigation challenges become more complex. The terrain becomes more three-dimensional. Not just latitude and longitude, but also elevation becomes critical. The expedition must find passes through mountain ranges, must avoid cliffs and canyons that would block progress, must manage the increased difficulty of travel at higher elevations. Diego, marching near the middle of the column, has no understanding of the navigation decisions being made by the leadership. He simply follows the man in front of him, trusting that someone knows where they are going, focusing on the immediate challenges of the steep trail, the thin air at higher elevation, the fatigue that makes each step an effort. The path they follow is not a road in any European sense, but a trail, sometimes a clearly defined indigenous path, showing signs of regular use, sometimes barely a game trail through the vegetation, sometimes no path at all, and the expedition must cut its way through. The trail climbs steeply, switchbacking up mountain slopes, crossing streams in deep ravines, traversing narrow ledges where a misstep could mean a fatal fall. The horses and pack animals suffer terribly in this terrain. Several animals fall, tumbling down slopes, breaking legs or dying from the falls. The surviving animals struggle with the steep grades and the thin air, requiring frequent rest, slowing the expedition's progress even further. By evening of the second day in the mountains, the expedition emerges onto a high pass and gets their first clear view of the terrain ahead. To the west, the mountains continue, range after range extending to the horizon, a vista of rugged terrain that makes clear that they face many more days or weeks of difficult mountain travel before reaching the lowlands beyond. Bastidas studies the view with growing concern. His maps suggested the mountains were narrower, that they could cross them in a few days. The reality, visible before him, is that the mountains are much more extensive, that maintaining the westward route will require far more time and effort than planned. That evening, he calls another council with his officers and with the indigenous guides. The discussion is frank about the expedition's deteriorating situation. Food supplies are critically low, perhaps a week's worth of provisions remain. The men are exhausted and demoralized. Casualties continue to mount from disease and injury. The terrain ahead appears even more difficult than what they have already crossed. Cuauhtémoc offers guidance. There is a pass to the southwest, perhaps 3 days from here, that descends into a valley where there are villages, food, easier travel. If we go that way, we can resupply, rest, then continue toward the Maya territories along valley routes. This suggestion represents abandoning the direct westward route in favor of a more circuitous but more practical path. It means accepting indigenous geographic knowledge over Spanish maps and European navigation methods. After lengthy debate, Conquistadors reluctantly accepts the recommendation. The expedition will alter course toward the southwest, seeking the pass Cuauhtémoc describes, hoping to find the promised villages and easier terrain. This decision, forced by the reality that the Spanish navigation tools and maps were inadequate for the actual terrain, demonstrates a fundamental truth about conquistador expeditions. Despite Spanish claims of superiority, and despite possession of advanced navigation tools like compasses and astrolabes, the expeditions were fundamentally dependent on indigenous knowledge to successfully traverse the American landscape. Without indigenous guides who knew the terrain, who understood where routes existed and where travel was impossible, who could communicate with local peoples to obtain information and supplies, most conquistador expeditions would have failed completely. The Spanish tools and techniques were useful, but insufficient. They needed to be supplemented with indigenous knowledge to achieve navigation success. As the expedition prepares to alter course the next morning, following Cuauhtémoc's guidance toward the southwest, the soldiers understand little of the navigation decisions that have led to this change. They simply follow orders, trust their leaders, and hope that someone knows what they are doing, continuing to endure the hardships of jungle and mountain travel in pursuit of objectives that seem increasingly distant and uncertain. As we conclude our exploration of how conquistadors crossed jungles with armor and no roads, let us step back from the specific narrative and examine what this reveals about Spanish conquest in the Americas, about the realities versus the legends, and about the complex interactions between Spanish and indigenous peoples that characterize this historical period. The expedition we have been following represents a composite of actual conquistador experiences, drawing on historical accounts from numerous expeditions: Hernán Cortés's march from Veracruz to Tenochtitlan, Francisco Pizarro's expedition to Peru, various entradas into the Amazon basin and other jungle regions, and many smaller expeditions documented in contemporary chronicles and letters. These historical sources reveal several consistent realities about conquistador jungle expeditions that our narrative has illustrated. First, the journeys were far more difficult than popular imagination suggests. The conquistadors did not stride heroically through the jungle, easily overcoming obstacles through European superiority. Instead, they struggled desperately against terrain and climate that their equipment and training had not prepared them for, suffering catastrophic casualties from disease, exhaustion, and the simple, overwhelming difficulty of jungle travel. Historical mortality rates from jungle expeditions were staggering. 50% or higher mortality was not uncommon for extended expeditions. Cortés lost approximately 2/3 of his men during his initial march to Tenochtitlan, though many of those losses came from combat with indigenous forces rather than from jungle travel itself. Other expeditions suffered even worse. Pánfilo de Narváez's expedition to Florida resulted in nearly complete destruction of the Spanish force. Second, Spanish equipment, while technologically advanced in some ways, was often poorly suited to tropical conditions. Steel armor became a liability rather than an asset in jungle heat. European weapons, while formidable, were not uniformly superior to indigenous weapons. Obsidian-edged weapons could cut as effectively as steel swords. Indigenous bows were often superior to European crossbows in rate of fire, if not in penetration, and indigenous knowledge of the environment was far more valuable than European military training. The adoption of indigenous equipment, cotton armor instead of steel, lightweight weapons, machetes for clearing paths, demonstrates that the Spanish recognized these realities and adapted accordingly. The successful conquistadors were those who learned from indigenous peoples and who adopted indigenous technologies and techniques, not those who rigidly adhered to European methods. Third, the expeditions were absolutely dependent on indigenous people, as guides, as interpreters, as porters, as sources of local knowledge about terrain, water, food, and navigation. Without this indigenous assistance, most expeditions would have failed to reach their objectives. This dependence is often minimized or omitted in traditional conquest narratives that emphasize Spanish agency and superiority. But the historical record is clear. Spanish leaders relied heavily on indigenous allies, guides, and laborers. Cortés's conquest of the Aztec Empire succeeded largely because of his alliances with indigenous groups who hated Aztec rule and who provided warriors, supplies, and intelligence. Pizarro's conquest of the Inca similarly depended on indigenous allies and on civil war within the Inca Empire. The treatment of these indigenous collaborators was typically brutal. Enslaved labor, minimal compensation, casual violence, high mortality from overwork and disease. This exploitation was central to Spanish conquest methods, providing the labor force necessary for expeditions, while treating indigenous people as expendable resources. Fourth, navigation in the New World required combining European tools with indigenous knowledge. Compasses and astrolabes provided valuable directional reference and latitude determination. But without indigenous guidance about actual routes, about terrain features, about the locations of settlements and resources, these tools were insufficient for successful navigation. The maps that conquistadors possessed were crude and often wildly inaccurate. Geographic knowledge improved gradually as more expeditions reported their findings, but in the early conquest period, the Spanish were essentially exploring unknown territory with inadequate information, depending on indigenous informants to fill critical knowledge gaps. Fifth, disease was the greatest killer. More conquistadors died from tropical diseases, malaria, yellow fever, dysentery, various parasitic infections, than died from combat with indigenous peoples. The Spanish had no effective treatments for these diseases and no understanding of how they spread or how to prevent them. Ironically, disease also worked in the Spanish favor in devastating indigenous populations who lacked immunity to European diseases. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and other introduced diseases killed millions of indigenous people, destroying social structures, depopulating regions, and creating chaos that facilitated Spanish conquest. This was largely unintentional. The Spanish didn't understand disease transmission and couldn't have deliberately weaponized disease, even if they had wanted to. But the effect was catastrophic for indigenous peoples. Sixth, the motivations for these expeditions, gold, land, titles, advancement, drove men to endure almost unimaginable hardships and to inflict terrible suffering on others in pursuit of these goals. The conquistadors were not motivated by noble ideals, despite the religious justifications they offered, but by straightforward greed and ambition. This doesn't make them unique. Humans throughout history have pursued wealth and power through violent means. But it does require us to look critically at conquest narratives that romanticize or justify the conquistadors' actions. The expeditions brought devastating consequences for indigenous peoples: conquest, enslavement, cultural destruction, epidemic disease, and these consequences cannot be separated from individual Spanish soldiers' personal motivations and experiences. Seventh, the technology and techniques we've examined, machetes for clearing paths, cotton armor adapted from indigenous designs, rafts and vine bridges for river crossing, dead reckoning navigation, supplemented by indigenous route knowledge, represent the practical realities of jungle travel that any group attempting to cross such terrain would need to address. Modern military forces and explorers in jungle environments use many of the same basic techniques: clearing paths through vegetation, improvising river crossings, relying on local guides who know the terrain, managing disease and environmental challenges through preparation and adaptation. The specific tools have improved. Modern machetes are better than 16th century blades. Modern navigation tools are far superior to compasses and astrolabes. Modern medicine can treat many diseases that were fatal in the conquest era. But the fundamental challenges remain similar. What lessons can we draw from examining how conquistadors crossed jungles? Several emerge. First, technological superiority is not sufficient for success in unfamiliar environments. The Spanish possessed steel weapons, armor, horses, and firearms, technologies that seemed to give them decisive advantages. But in jungle environments, these advantages were often negated or reversed by terrain, climate, and indigenous adaptation. Success required not just technology, but knowledge, adaptability, and willingness to learn from those familiar with the environment. Second, the importance of indigenous knowledge and assistance cannot be overstated. The Spanish succeeded not because they were superior to indigenous peoples, but because they could leverage indigenous labor, knowledge, and assistance, while indigenous societies were weakened by internal conflicts and epidemic disease. Without indigenous allies and collaborators, Spanish conquest would have been impossible. Third, the costs of conquest were enormous for everyone involved. High mortality for Spanish soldiers, catastrophic devastation for indigenous populations, exploitation and death for enslaved laborers. The wealth and territories gained by the Spanish crown and by individual conquistadors came at terrible human cost, a cost that shaped the history of the Americas for centuries. Fourth, the narratives we tell about historical events often omit or minimize the suffering, the failures, the dependence on others that characterize the actual events. The conquistador legend emphasizes Spanish heroism, determination, and superiority, while minimizing disease, desperation, brutal treatment of indigenous peoples, and dependence on indigenous assistance. Examining the practical realities, how expeditions actually crossed jungles, what tools and techniques they used, what challenges they faced, helps correct these misleading narratives. As we conclude our exploration, we can appreciate the genuine hardships that conquistadors endured. The jungle travel was indeed difficult. The suffering was real. The determination required to push forward through terrible conditions was remarkable. But we must also recognize that this suffering was largely self-inflicted, chosen in pursuit of wealth and conquest, and that it resulted in far greater suffering inflicted on indigenous peoples who had the misfortune to be in the path of Spanish expansion. The tools and techniques we've examined, machetes and totten armor, vine bridges and dugout canoes, dead reckoning navigation, and indigenous guidance. These were the practical means by which the conquest was carried out, the material reality underlying the historical transformation of the Americas from indigenous-controlled territories to Spanish colonies. Understanding these practical details helps us see the conquest not as the inevitable triumph of superior civilization, but as a contingent historical process that succeeded through a specific combination of circumstances: Spanish determination and ruthlessness, indigenous assistance and collaboration, epidemic disease, superior ocean-going vessels that allowed Spanish reinforcement and resupply, and numerous other factors that together enabled European conquest despite the many difficulties and the numerous occasions when expeditions failed or nearly failed. The legacy of this conquest continues to shape the Americas today, in demographics, in languages and cultures, in economic systems, in social structures, in the ongoing tensions between indigenous peoples and descendant populations of colonizers. Understanding how the conquest actually happened, in practical terms of tools and techniques and day-to-day survival, contributes to understanding this legacy and the complex history that created the modern Americas.